In the name of the Father, and the Son, the Holy Spirit, we continue our reading of the book that's written in maybe in the beginning of the 1900s, the 20th century, by a Catholic priest who studied in the L'École de Bibli, the very famous institute of the Bible archaeology in Jerusalem. And he wrote it with a dense archaeological background. He wrote it for the regular reader. He didn't write this book, which is titled The Last Hour of Jesus. He didn't write it for the scholar and the person who are going to take it as a reference, who wrote it with a simple language for the everyday reader. It's a very good book. I recommend it especially for the time around the Holy Week, where you are going to celebrate and memorize or commemorate uh, the, the, the suffering, the death and burial of the Lord. It studies the hours from the Last Supper all the way to, or after the Last Supper, all the way to his burial. Last time we reached chapter 15, where Jesus was returned from Herod to Pilate. And last time we saw that Pilate had made up his mind that Jesus is innocent, and he's going to try to find a way to get him acquitted and to get him free without offending much the leaders of the Jews. He doesn't want to have trouble on his hand. But apparently Pilate, as we saw, was not a strong character. He can be persuaded by pressure. And he underestimated the resilience of the enemies of the Lord, the high priest and the scribes and the Pharisees, who got together and they were determined to put the Lord to death. The next chapter, chapter 16, is about Jesus condemned. It's titled Christ Condemned. Now, Pilate had taken the Lord into his private quarters inside the Antonia, the castle. And outside there was this flagstone paved courtyard. And it's famous because in archaeology they had never found anything like it. They said the flagstones were 3 feet by 3 feet each, 18-inch, a foot and a half thick. This is very remarkable work. And it's a big, big, big courtyard. It can host maybe 1,000, 2,000 people in there. They had two names for it. It is called Gabbatha, which is the Aramaic word, or the Greek word. And the Greek word for it is Lithostrotos, means the stony pavement. Litho, it's come from stone, strotus, the pavement, or the pavement. That's how they called it. And it's famous, the Gabbatha, the Aramaic name, or in general they call it Hebrew. Aramaic and Hebrew was used to name the language that the everyday Jew would use in the first century. We'll talk about the language a little later. So this is called Gabbatha, and they meant the high place. And that was in general the title given to the place where the Antonia was built. Is the highest place in Jerusalem. Go back to Pilate. He left Jesus in the inside quarters of Antonia, where he had him and he talked to him about truth and the whole thing. And he went out, and he's trying to move swiftly now to get done with what he is trying to do. So his mind is persuaded that Jesus is innocent. He had done it. He had said this many, many times. It didn't seem like this is convincing to the leaders, to the enemies of the Lord. So he had went out and told him um, that he is determined to leave to release him. There was a big riot. It seems like from the Gospels, the leaders were not very excited about this decision. So one of the chief priests quieted the people and spoke to Pilate in a single voice. And he said, "If you release this man, you're no friend of Caesar." Right? That statement froze Pilate. Pilate actually frozen when he heard that. It didn't say it clearly. There was a threat there, and if he releases Jesus, they would report him to Caesar, and because this man, that's Jesus, according to their accusation, he is calling himself a king against Caesar. So if Pilate is to release him, he is part of the treason. So Pilate will be considered the traitor. This is a very, very serious accusation against Pilate, because he makes himself a king against Caesar. Now, when Pilate heard this with this tone, he started to think again about the decision. And he said to himself, what is the life now? If I'm going to release him, they might be reporting me to Caesar, and I might lose my position and even my life. In the Roman Empire, it was not a simple matter if you are called a traitor, especially to Caesar. This would mean a very big trouble for the procurator, for Pilate. So what he to do? And then in a flash of a second, he knew what he needed to do. So what is the life of one Jew if he puts it in the scale against his career and even his life? He got tired of the whole business and he wanted to finish it. But he didn't at this point. He was careful not to hurt their feelings. But then he changed his attitude all of a sudden, and he wanted to really taunt them and turned against them. So he made up his mind. He made up his mind. In a choice between himself and his career and the life of Jesus Christ on the other side, he chose himself and his career. In the end, he lost both. He lost both of them. I'll tell you something about this. Forever, the writer said this, and it's a very interesting remark. Forever, the Christians, now we say it all the time, maybe more than one time a day, mention Pilate a few times in the creed and in the confession of the priest. Forever, the Christians will remember that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate. That Pontius suffered and died under Pontius Pilate. So his name would be linked to the suffering and the death of the Lord. St. John is the one who records what happened after that. So he goes and brings up Jesus to the crowd. He takes him from the inside and brings him out. And so Pilate brought Jesus outside. That's what St. John would say, to the place where it's called in Hebrew Gabbatha. And then John also, the St. John writes, it was the preparation day for Passover. So it's only in the Gospel of St. John that puts Friday, the Good Friday, as the preparation day, as if the Passover would be Saturday, but the eating of the Passover would be on Friday Eve. The Gabbatha is the name in Aramaic, we said, and if you call it, if the Gospel called that Hebrew, in the Hebrew language, because that's what the tongue of the common man in Israel in those days. Where did they learn the Aramaic? They learned it in their time of the exile, when they were in Babylon and in Persia. They learned that language, and this was the international language at the time, the Aramaic. But then it's called Hebrew because that's the tongue of the Hebrews. The classical Hebrew, the original Hebrew that the Torah was written with, was a dead language, only used in the synagogues. Very similar to the Coptic language. When you talk about the Coptic language, we say the Copts, their language is Coptic. No, it's not. We speak English or Arabic, but Coptic is the dead language that we only use in the church. I say it was come with some hurt, some pain, and like the Jews would say the same thing. The Hebrew is dead, but we use Aramaic.
Abuna, how did the Hebrew language become revitalized? Because then now
No, they don't have, actually, they have Yiddish.
Okay.
Yiddish language, and this is actually even a more modern language than the classical Hebrew. Again, if you ask the Jewish boy who's learning the Torah or going to the synagogue, he would learn classical Hebrew as you and I would learn classical Greek or Coptic or classical Armenian, right?
Yeah.
It's not the same. It's not the same.
Yeah.
But don't forget, Hebrew and Aramaic are Semitic language. They're sister languages. They have much in common. Now, when we talk about times. So there is the Gospel of St. John puts the crucifixion, and Jesus was crucified at the 6th hour, while St. Mark would say it was the 3rd hour of the day, right? And the writer of the book would say there are few systems of timing that was used at the time. So you can actually say we count the hours from the 6th hour, like 6 o'clock in the morning by our reckoning. So the first hour will be 6 to 7, 7 to 8 is the second, 8 to 9. But there is other calculations that actually divide the daytime, the light time, into 3 hours. So that would be the first hour, the second hour, the third hour. So this is like every one of them would be 3 hours or 4 hours. So you can divide them into different ways. You can divide them by an hour, or you can divide them by 2 hours, or you can divide them by 3 hours, and each of them would be called an hour. So the third hour, it's the same as the 6th hour by John, but there's using 2 different timing methods. So he made up his mind to condemn the Lord, and he started to mock the leaders, to mock them and to taunt them. So he bring him out, and he says, "Behold your king," in a very taunting tone. Like he toned it like, circus. Was Jesus with the crown of thorns, of course, and the reed in his hand, and he's mutilated with the scourging. So they recognize the way he speaks, and so they understood that he's trying to mock them, to play with them, and to ridicule them. So they say, "Away with him." There's a change in part, like I said. In the beginning, he was trying very much to respect their feelings, to be sensitive, all that stuff. But once he found that they're actually threatening him, he started to change his way. So he's going to use Jesus to mock them, to make them feel ridiculous. So the answer was very violent. "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him! Are you calling this our king? We don't want him. This is your toy. We want him killed. If you're going to make us feel bad by this figure, we want this figure destroyed." And then he goes again and says, "Shall I crucify your king? Your king?" And he puts the stress on your king. "Shall I crucify your king?" And then they made the fateful words. In answer to Pilate, they make this very powerful statement: "We have no king but Caesar." They give up the kingdom of God. They gave up the hope in the Messiah. They gave up everything that Israel is looking for in one statement. And they replaced the kingdom of God with the Roman Empire in one statement. "We have no king but Caesar," they replied. they were fateful words. They were very fateful words. The choice was fatal to them and to Israel. Pilate could see that his mockery, he is actually successful. He made them sting. They were smarting now. He put his arrows in the right place, and they responded with anger. He got them out of their balance. But he said, if I go on with this, I can actually have a riot on my hand. It's Saint Matthew that records the incidents of the note from Pilate's wife. He's the only evangelist to record another episode that would actually fit. Pilate takes water and washes his hand. Something very unpopular. Nobody does this. It's written in the Torah somewhere, but it's not. It's something that shows that Pilate was completely out of balance. That he took water and washed his hands to get himself rid of the guilt of the blood of Christ. So when Pilate does this, so he knew that this was the unjust sentence. He knew all the way. So he wanted to dissociate himself in a public and dramatic manner from responsibility to the affair. He was simple. He was not like a very religious man, but he understood there's a very big guilt for this one. So he answered to them, see to it yourselves. See to it yourselves. You go do it. I'm not going to be part of it. It's a reminder, the book says, of the same statement given by the Sanhedrin to Judas. When Judas said, I can't take this money. I surrendered an innocent blood. So they tell him, what does that to do with us? See to it yourself. Go suit yourself. Find out how you're going to. This is not our guilt. You're guilty. It's your business. Deal with it. So he's saying to them, you're guilty. I don't want to be part of it. You see to it yourself. They didn't really have a problem. They were not hesitant like Pilate. They understood Pilate's hesitation. They will make it willingly, all of them. So when he washed his hands and said to them, see to it yourselves, they understood that he is feeling guilty. And so they are trying to get it done with, to relieve him of the guilt. They said another fateful statement. What did they say? All the people answered. Matthew tells us and said, his blood be on us and on our children. That's calling a curse on them, and not them alone, but on their children. This is unprecedented in history. People can call curses on themselves, but this is the only time the history records that people call curses on their children. And the writer of the book made a very good connection. He said, 40 years later, he wondered about the Jewish men who were crucified, looking down from crosses, and them and their fathers. Did they realize that this is the fulfillment of the curse that their fathers called upon them? 40 years later, Titus, the Roman leader of the army who besieged Jerusalem, did not find enough wood to make crosses for the Jews that he needed to crucify. They said the roads to Jerusalem for miles and miles were lined up with the crosses of all the Jews that he crucified. It was one of the most horrific chapters in the history of humanity. What happened to Jerusalem in 70 AD. Josephus recorded 1.5 million Jew was killed in the siege, either by direct killing or by crucifixion. And there were actually a similar number sent out to slavery. Did any of them realize that this is the curse that their fathers had called upon them? Now, Pilate sent quickly now to bring the unsavory business to an end. He wanted to finish this, not really something very. So he pronounced the sentence, and in Latin it would be like this. It will be ibis in crucem, which means to the cross you shall go. That was the sentence that was given to the condemned person when they are crucified. So there were two different charges in the trial of Christ, and the two different charges, and two different courts, and two different judges. The first court was charging the Lord with blasphemy, calling himself the Son of God. And the second court charged the Lord with treason, and he was found guilty in both of them. The first one did not have the power over life and death because the Roman had taken it away from them. And the second one, who found him innocent, was pushed to make the verdict. And if we want to make sure who is more guilty than the other, the Lord had said it already, that the high priest's guilt was much more than Pilate in this case, because he knew what was going on, and he had delivered the Lord to the Romans. And if you want to go a little bit earlier, there was a friend of Christ who had made the easy surrender of the Lord to the Jews, and then from the Jews to the Romans, which it seems like three circles. The innermost circle is the circle of the disciples. One of them had to do it. The Lord would not leave the church. The church had to deliver the Lord to his death. And then from there, he goes to the outer circle, which is the Jews, and the Sanhedrin is the highest court. And then from the outer circle to the outermost circle, the circle of humanity, the Romans now were the leaders. They're the governors of the empire. And there he was also condemned to death. So this is the three circles that the Lord had to go through to become the Savior of the world. Now, once Pilate had made the sentence, he had to send the Lord to the cross. In the Roman world, you don't keep a condemned person to the cross, but you do it the same day. No person who is judged and condemned to the cross would be kept. They would have to do it immediately after the judgment. The Romans didn't waste time. It was a military business. It was done by the military personnel. The sentence would be signed. There was some papers to be filled and the reports, so that when the records were sent to Rome, it was legally correct. They had to be legally correct, signed by the procurator. Now, it seems like that the Lord would be accompanied by other two criminals. If we know that the judgment had to be done on the same day of the crucifixion, then when did the Pilate try the case for the other two criminals? The writer of the book says most probably when Jesus was sent to Herod, Pilate had the time to try the other cases, or even when he was scourged, when he was the toy and the game of the Roman soldiers. Now, what would they do after that? They would write the sentence or the claim of the judgment on a board, usually painted with white, and the guilt or the judgment will be written in black or red letters. In the case of Christ, it was written, according to the gospel writers, in three languages: Aramaic, or that's what they call Hebrew, Greek, the international language, and Latin, which is the Roman Empire language. So anyone who would come to the city and look on the crosses will see the verdict, will see the criminal charges that led to the cross. They had to be in a very conspicuous place. Everybody has to see them, as many people as possible, because they were an example to what happens to those who oppose the Roman rule. When they take the placards, the boards, they either hang it on the neck of the condemned, so they go with it, or they lift it up in the beginning of the procession. And they have to take a very crowded route so that more people can see what's going on. They usually don't hold, historically, they don't give the cross, the whole cross. the horizontal beam and the vertical beam to the condemned to carry. They only load the horizontal one. So for Jesus to have that part, he would have to extend his hands like this and hold the beam on his shoulder. And sometimes, so that it doesn't fall, they tie it with ropes to his hands. So it would be always this, and it would be carried on his shoulders. One of the practices also, we talked about this before they send them on the road to the crucifixion, they scourged them. That was the practice. But the Lord was exempted because he was scourged earlier during the trial. In a trial from Pilate to release him, he said, I would chastise him, and this was done earlier. And it weakened him a lot. What else? They stripped him of the cloth. That's to walk them naked in the streets. So people, when they look at them, they are humiliated. In the case of the Lord, this was not done. And why? Because the Romans respected the modesty of the Jewish traditions. They didn't want to stir up anger. They didn't strip the condemned to the cross naked. They didn't want to do that. In addition, they didn't put the cross inside the city. One more thing. Sometimes you hear they kept the vertical beam in place and they changed the horizontal beam with the condemned. This is not done in the Jewish area because that's what the governors learned. You don't keep that pole. It is a curse. The Jews would not allow that. They wouldn't have that pole where you hang a person to die on. It's a curse. They didn't want to do that to offend them. So these are things that you have to keep in mind. Did he have the crown of thorns when he walked the streets? No one knows. We don't have any history if he had gone out with the crown of thorns. But he went out of the Antonia fortress, which was in the north side of the temple, the northmost point in Jerusalem. And they were on the west side of the fortress. They would take, if they can, there is a gate very close by that leads outside the city, and they call it the fish gate. It would have been a couple of 100 yards from the Antonia, but it would have been empty. The soldiers would want to take Jesus and the two other criminals through the crowded streets of the market. So they go through the bazaar, the places where people sell and buy, so all the people can see him, as many people as possible. So they took, they calculated 500 to 600 yards, and that's the Via Dolorosa, the road of the cross. Today, we don't have it. You know, most tour guides will tell you that. It's buried. It's buried under the city, way under the city, at least 13 feet under. If you go with the tour guides, they will tell you there's only one flagstone that belongs to the old road. And they will take you to that spot and tell you, this is the only stone that belongs to the Via Dolorosa which Jesus walked on. But the rest of it is buried. And all those places that you visit today is on top of the original, according to tradition. What happens during the Via Dolorosa? The Catholic have the tradition of the way of the cross or the stations of the cross. Some of it is the gospel in the gospel. Some of it is pure tradition. Some of it is almost mythology. So the writer of the gospel would say, where Jesus met his mother has nothing to do with history or even the gospels, of course, not in the gospels, not even history. It's impossible, historically impossible. So this is most probably a myth. Likewise, also the towel of Veronica. It's implausible. It's improper. It should never have. It should never been picked as a real story. But we know that it actually belongs to the history of the shroud. This is the shroud on top of the story of the cross, and we talked about this when we talked about the shroud. How that piece of the face was only shown, and people called it the real icon, Veronica, or the Veritatis icona, or something like that in Latin. Veritas or veras means true. So when the rest of it is very true, that he on the road very close to a place called Ephraim Gate. Ephraim Gate is where the north wall meets the west wall. The road wall that runs north south meets the one that runs west or east west. There's a gate called Ephraim Gate, and if you notice in the map, Golgotha or Calvary is on the northwest side outside the city. So he has to go from Antonia, which is on the top, to go down like a little bit, go out of Ephraim to go through the market, and then go to the west and up to be in Calvary. Before he goes through the door, that's very, very true. You know, according to the writer, it says, he says, by the time Jesus goes and carries the beam, which is weighed, okay, the beam itself weighs between 75 to 100 pounds. The whole cross is 200 pounds. So this is impossible for anybody, even if they're totally healthy, to carry on a stony paved stuff. And then at the second part of the Via Dolorosa, it's uphill. Given the agony in the garden, given the scourging and the lack of sleep and the dehydration and the bleeding and the severe sadness, given all that, no one. So most probably Jesus, and this is true from the Station of the Cross, had fell maybe many times under the weight of the crossbeam. When the centurion noticed that, so one thing they do is they tie a rope around the waist of the victim and they pull him so that he doesn't stop. Mel Gibson did it in the movie by having the Roman soldier says, "I don't have the whole day for you. Move." And they scourge and they pull. So when he fell a few times, the centurion, they give, so the sentence was made, and the centurion is by the name it means, centurion, cent, it means 100. He's a leader of 100. So he noticed that Jesus is very weak and he's falling under the cross. So they have someone coming from the gate. That's how the gospel says. Which gate? Ephraim Gate. He's coming from the same gate that Jesus is going to go out from. So they take him and forced labor to carry the cross beam behind him. Jesus goes and he behind him carry cross beam, fulfilling literally what Jesus said, if someone wants to be my disciple, let him carry his cross and follow me. It's interesting because St. Mark is the one who writes something about this person. It's Simon the Cyrenian. Cyrenica is west of Egypt, and it's the place that included Libya and Tunisia today, all the way to Carthage. So this is a place west of Egypt, and it's a big country. At the time, was very influential. The capital was very influential. Had a school of philosophy and had a trade center, and later on has a big group of Jews living there. So Simon the Cyrenian, most probably, and his family came to the city and had some work to do with a family or something in the fields. That's he were coming from the field. He was coming from the fields. As he enters from the gate, the centurion looks at him and says, "This man, get this man. Seems like he's a big built man. He can help him carry the cross." So he carries the cross behind Jesus. St. Mark says that he was, it's very interesting, the father of Alexandrus and Rufus. And the writer of the book says, if St. Mark wrote this gospel to the Roman Jews and Roman Christians, then most probably the two sons, Rufus and Alexandrus, were known to the Christian church in Rome. It's not implausible, it's very probable that Rufus is the same Rufus St. Paul greeted in his letter to the Romans. And he said, "Greet Rufus and his mother, who is my mother." So apparently the story says that most probably the family of Simon the Cyrenian had become Christians at the time of the apostles, and the sons were in the church and they were known. On any case, They went through the Ephraim gate, and there the centurion, not far, maybe 100 yards or so, the centurion pointed to a place on the right side where he thought it would be a very good place for everybody on this road who's coming to the city to see the crucified people. And they started very quickly to prepare for that gruesome work of crucifixion, which we will do next time, God willing. Anyone who has a question about this? Next time we will talk about Calvary, and hopefully the last 7 words of Christ. I'm hoping to do that. At least some of them. Some of the words that Jesus had said, and we hope to finish this book in the next 2 times. We're about to, Calvary is chapter 18, and then the last 7 words are, the 7 last words are chapter 19, and then the rest is after Christ's death is chapter 20 and 21. There are a few pages there. All right. Right. Let's say our Father. In the name of the Father and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, make us worthy, O Lord, say thankfully. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Through Christ Jesus our Lord. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory now and forever. Amen. Before I leave, if you feel pain when you listen to the story, it's good pain. It's very good pain, because that's the pain that is intended to heal us. It's like, medicine. When you take medicine, sometimes you take very bitter medicine. I say, you drink and say, is this what will make me feel better? I feel better already. I don't want it. But it will make us feel better, because the Agpeya especially says, and by the nails with which you were nailed, rescue our minds from the thoughts of the earthly lusts. And remember how St. Peter says, by his stripes we were healed. So that the suffering, the meditation on the suffering of the Christ is healing. It heals the heart. It's like the cautery or the medicine that actually may be very difficult to take, but it actually brings healing. It's okay. It's really okay. And I think it is very important that we don't let go of that pain, because it's made for us. He didn't do it for anybody else. It's for us. So we have to use it for our healing. We have to use everything Jesus did for our healing. May the love of God the Father and grace of His only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you. Peace be with you. Good night.